Hello, thank you so much for joining me tonight. You are watching The Kim Iverson Show. Tonight, let's talk about a group that doesn't get a whole lot of attention, yet they are extremely powerful in controlling an aspect of U.S. foreign policy, and that would be the Cuba lobby. Now, the Cuba lobby is a little different than other lobby groups such as APAC or CARE or other sort of foreign policy style groups. The Cuba lobby is a little bit more of a loose knit, unorganized group of people, all with the same agenda, working in cohesion together in that same one agenda. Now, these are people that have been historically very anti Castro. They have deployed a numerous number of different tactics to control US policy, from terrorism to intimidation to character assassinations to just flat out propaganda. Now, this is a group of people that historically had been a bunch of Cuban expatriates who were, for a long time, they were sort of the white wealthy class that was sort of uh, kicked out of Cuba at the end of the revolution. They weren't going to make their money anymore, and so they had to hightail it out of there. But the lobby has since shifted and changed, and over the years has become even more moderate. For a long time, it was a very far right group of people that had a very extreme stance when it came to Cuba. But that group has now sort of shifted a little bit. We're seeing some of the signs of that shift over time. But for the most part, that group still has a pretty far right agenda and attitude in regards to Cuba. But one thing they really have is an enormous grip on our government. Now, talking about some of the tactics that the Cuba lobby has deployed throughout the years, in the 70s, they used actual terrorism. There were these anti Castro terrorist groups that actually assassinated a couple of Cuban Americans who wanted to open up dialogue between Castro and the United States. There were others that decided to deploy numerous bombs throughout Miami. So we saw these sort of terrorist organizations that were trying to control the US policy in regards to Cuba. Really staunch anti Castro, did not want the US to even let up a little bit when it came to the policy between the US and Cuba. Over the years, those tactics have shifted. Obviously, you cannot operate and be super influential if you're going to be using terrorism tactics in the United States for too long. So the tactics shifted. And of course, they started to do things such as paying off some politicians. But the Cuba lobby doesn't actually use money in the same way that other lobbies use money, such as APAC. APAC spends a lot of money buying off all of our politicians. The Cuba lobby acts more like the mob. They don't really buy off politicians. Now, they do spend some, and we'll go into that, especially the surprising person in the House of Representatives who takes more Cuba lobby money than anybody else. We're going to be talking about that person here in a little bit. But the Cuba lobby actually uses more mafia style tactics in order to get what they want out of US politicians. And they don't just go after the politicians, they go after the diplomats, the bureaucrats, the career officials who are in the government. And the various different tactics the Cuba lobby use is they've done things such as career ending tactics. For example, Bill Clinton, when he was president, wanted to nominate a particular person as an assistant secretary of state. That person had visited Cuba. So the Cuba lobby put the kibosh on that real quickly. There was another person who was inside of the Clinton administration. The Cuba lobby demanded Bill Clinton fire that person. That person had actually helped facilitate an agreement with Cuba in order to allow safe and legal migration for Cubans. That person was fired. They were seen to be too sympathetic to Cuba, too sympathetic to Castro. Anyone who was seen as sympathetic or somehow, pro Castro or pro Cuba or or sympathetic in any way, really was targeted in a very sinister McCarthyism like way. They were accused of being spies for Cuba. They were accused of espionage, working for Castro. In fact, one person who was actually the Ana Montes, She was a career Defense Intelligence Agency analyst. She was convicted of spying for Cuba in 2001 and sentenced to 25 years in prison. She's still serving prison to this day. I believe she's set to get out January of 2023. So subsequently, anyone who countered this sort of far right irrational stance on Cuba within the government lived under the threat that they would be the next Ana Montez, that if they didn't watch it, they would be accused of being a spy for Cuba and potentially face prison time. So the Cuba lobby used a variety of these tactics in order to control US policy. So it wasn't just buying off politicians like many of the other lobbies, but instead they're using these actual intimidation, mafia style tactics to control the narrative. And that narrative is hardline, maximum pressure on Cuba, no trade, do not open up, continue the blockade. Now, you look at similar other refugee style groups that have come into America, my family, my people, if you will, for example, the Vietnamese. Now, the Vietnamese people had a similar sort of history when it comes to the Vietnam and the Vietnam War and communism. But there was a big difference. The Vietnamese people here in the United States did not advocate for the crushing of Vietnam, where our family lives. We have family members in Vietnam. They were living under a blockade for a while where life was very, very difficult for them. And actually, the Vietnamese people had a bit of a different stance than the Cubans and instead wanted the United States to open up relations with Vietnam. And now we're seeing that Vietnam has flourished as a country, even though it is still communist. So Cuba is in that same sort of vein, communist country. Now, whether you're for or against communism or not, it really doesn't matter. And sort of my stance on the whole thing is it's none of our business, quite frankly. I'm very anti-intervention. I do not think the US needs to be meddling around the world. We are not the world's police. We need to end these wars, and we just need to kind of stay out of everybody's business. And when it comes to Cuba, one way that we've continued to meddle, one way that we've attempted to maintain control or to try to affect regime change, which is an act of war, that is an act of war, has been to implement this blockade, this devastating economic blockade on Cuba. Now, a big question is, what would happen if there was no blockade? And I think the answer is pretty clear. They would be similar to Vietnam. Their country would flourish. They would still be communist, yes. They would still be under a regime that maybe we're not all that friendly with, or wanting to have, or wanting even in our that type of government in our country. Fine, fair enough. But that's their country, their deal, none of our business. So if the blockade were lifted on Cuba, we probably would see something very, very similar. They probably would operate similarly to Vietnam, and their country would be flourishing right now. And the next thing you know, rather than seeing, like right now, we're seeing a lot of goods and products that are being shipped over to the United States that say made in Vietnam, maybe there would be a lot of things that say made in Cuba. But we're not seeing that because we have this irrational blockade on this country that is no threat to the United States. Now, unlike China, Cuba is no threat to the United States, not economically, not militarily. There is no threat coming from Cuba. So this is completely irrational. Why we would maintain a blockade on this country. It doesn't matter if they're living under a government you don't like. It doesn't matter if you don't like communism. Stay out of it. It's none of our business. We honestly don't need to have anything to do with Cuba. And that includes, we need to stop trying to crush them to try to affect regime change. By doing this, by the way, we create a national security crisis on our own. We have to then take in refugees. We have people that are starving, or, in Cuba, they're not starving. They're not at the point of starving. I know there's a lot of kind of narratives going on around the current protests and things that are going on in Cuba, but starving is not one of them. But nonetheless, we still would take in refugees. We still have this problem. And the same thing in Haiti. We have this problem when we meddle, and in Venezuela, where these people then show up at our borders and we have to take them in. So it's really not in our best national interest to continue these blockades. There's really nothing about it. And there's really no logic behind this sort of idea of, yeah, but we need to save them. And so the way we save them is by devastating them, by economically crushing them, to making the people sick and poor. We must do that to save those same very people. It makes no sense whatsoever. That is why a focus needs to be on the fact that there is this mafia style Cuba lobby that has an intense grip on our political system. So much so that Florida is the most important state when it comes to national elections. Also, irrational, but it only is that way because of the Cuban Americans. And the thing is, they like it that way, right? These Cuban Americans that are there, they don't really have any, even if they don't care any more about Cuba, which maybe they do, maybe they don't. Some of them are pretty far removed when it comes to life in Cuba. Some of them don't even have any family there, but they still hold on to this. And the reason they do is for that political power. Everybody loves to be wanted. Everybody loves to be courted. Everybody loves to be important. And a lot of these Cuban Americans are just feeling important. And so they're holding on to this irrational stance in order to remain politically important. So, um, now the Cuba lobby has deployed different tactics over the years. So there were these sort of terrorist tactics and these sort of career-ending tactics. They also deployed these propaganda-style tactics, and this is where it gets really important for the current uprisings that are going on now in Cuba. Um, there was radio and television that was created during Reagan, really starting these sort of propaganda style radio and television stations to try to infiltrate the minds of Cubans to get them to turn against their government. And now, with the rise of social media has played an important part. Now we see how our government has been screaming about, oh no, the Russians and social media, they got into our Facebook, they bought advertisements. Oh no, there's all these bots on Twitter. It's a real problem. Well, the US, even though screaming about other countries meddling in our elections, meddling in our governmental affairs, certainly takes those same tactics and uses it on others. And so social media has become incredibly powerful as a propaganda sort of source for information, meddling, causing uprisings. We know that this is possible. We accuse other countries of doing it to us. We certainly are doing it to other countries, and it wouldn't be the first time. In fact, we meddle way more than most other countries. And it's certainly in Latin America, we've done a lot of meddling with practically every country down in Latin America in some way, shape, or form. We've arranged coups or regime change or meddled in a variety of different ways. So it's not new. This isn't new. And one thing that I find really, really interesting is we know that these current uprisings started July 11th, yet on Twitter, the hashtag SOSCuba actually started trending in Florida July 9th. So in July 9th, we see this SOS Cuba begin trending on Twitter. Then suddenly we start seeing some videos coming out of Cuba with these Cubans saying that they need access to vaccines, that they want medicines, that they're starting to really point the finger at their government when it comes to the pandemic in particular. Hard to believe, in fact, because Cuba's actually done really, really well in regards to the pandemic. Cuba's actually been one of the most successful countries in managing the pandemic. For example, Cuba has a population roughly the same as Ohio, yet Ohio had 20,000 deaths. Cuba had, what, 1,600 or so deaths? So Cuba's actually not seeing overwhelmed hospitals. They're not seeing bodies piling up in the streets. Cuba is not suffering all that much in relation to other countries when it comes to the pandemic. So it's sort of hard to believe the narrative that the reason why these Cubans are uprising is because they want access to vaccines and medicine, and their dictatorship communist government won't give it to them. Now, what is believable is that they don't have any food. And that is something that has been a stress on Cuba since the US blockade on the country. It has gone on for a long, long time. They know how to manage that, though. They have rationed their food. They do know how to handle being poor and sharing amongst one another. Nobody starves in Cuba. Now, people don't get maybe like McDonald's and, all this fancy food that we get here in the United States, but people are not starving there. So, however, with the COVID-19 pandemic, Cuba is a big tourist country, a lot of tourism. They rely on tourism. In fact, people who drive cabs and work as bartenders make more money than government workers, and practically everybody in Cuba is a government worker. So tourism is a big way for them to make money. During the pandemic, they weren't making any money. So when you take the US blockade, you mix it with the lack of money from tourism, you end up with a real economic squeeze. Cuba's not the only country feeling this, though. That is being felt all over the world, especially tourist heavy countries like Italy, Greece, they're feeling a real strain because of the COVID-19 pandemic. One of the differences, though, those countries don't have a US blockade on them. So we can really sort of tie a lot, if not the vast majority, of the Cuban economic crisis on the US blockade. It would be directly blamed on the US blockade, and it would be simple enough for Joe Biden to lift it. But why doesn't Joe lift it? Well, the Cuba lobby, right? He's afraid of the Cuba lobby. He wants to potentially win Florida. He knows that he barely won the US election. He's really at risk of not winning re-election. He doesn't want to risk Florida. He wants to try to gain Florida as much as possible. And turning on the Cuba lobby would be really, really problematic for Joe Biden. Even though Donald Trump won Florida, Donald Trump's maximum pressure policy on Cuba was very popular with the Cuba lobby. This gave him an immense amount of success in Florida. Joe Biden doesn't want to really turn any of those Cubans that he might have some votes from. He doesn't want to turn any of them off. So Joe Biden, the guy that actually served as vice president under Obama, who wanted to lift the blockade against on Cuba, Joe Biden is continuing Trump's maximum pressure policy. And all of that comes down to the Cuba lobby. That is the entire reason. A lot of us sit here and, we see in the news or independent media people pointing the finger at various administrations saying it's this guy's fault or that person's fault or Republicans' fault or whoever's fault. But the real fault really lies on that Cuba lobby. I cannot stress that enough. So let's talk about the money that the Cuba lobby spends, because it's really, really interesting, especially when Obama became president. Now, the Cuba lobby has been historically very Republican. Same with like the Vietnamese. Like I mentioned before, the parallels are very similar. Vietnamese people vote Republican. Cubans vote Republican. Both of them are from communist countries, very different in their attitudes regarding their home countries. But the money, normally the Cuba lobby had spent a bunch of money on Republicans, but that all changed in 2008. So when Obama was set to become president, the Cuba lobby scrambled and said, oh, crap. Now we've got a Democrat who is not as controllable on this issue as Clinton was. We've got a Democrat in office who actually thinks that the embargo should be lifted. So what are we going to do? Well, the Cuba lobby decided in 2008 and throughout really all of Obama's presidency, they spent more money on Democrats than they did on Republicans. Now, a lot of people think the Cubans are always Republicans, spending money on Republicans, but no, in fact, the number one money taker from the Cuba lobby in the House of Representatives is Debbie Wasserman Schultz. That's right. Democrat Debbie Wasserman Schultz actually takes more money from the Cuba lobby than any other member of the House, including Republicans. And when you look at Debbie Wasserman Schultz policy on Cuba, for example, this is a Politico story from 2015. It says Debbie Wasserman Schultz breaks with Obama on Cuba. Surprise, surprise. She's taking the most money from the Cuba lobby. It says Florida Democrat Debbie Wasserman Schultz thinks President Barack Obama should slow down with Cuba before continuing to reopen relations between the two countries. She says, quote, my view is different from President Obama's, unquote. The DNC chairwoman said in an interview with the Daily Signal published Thursday, I believe a relationship with the United States should be earned. Perhaps we should make sure that some of these human rights concessions are secured prior to moving forward. Well, that Cuba money must be doing her real well, because she certainly has taken a different tone than many of the other Democrats who are not taking any Cuba lobby money. So they started shifting their focus on Democrats once Obama became president. They also started to shift their focus on bullying and intimidating Democrats. We also see inside of the community, the Cuban American community inside Miami, for example, a lot of just sort of intimidation and harassment tactics inside the community. So it's not just people like Marco Rubio taking to Twitter, firing off, bullying people, calling people out. It's not just Marco doing it. It's actually a lot of others inside of the community. So people that maybe are viewed to be friendly, or I should say sympathetic to the Cuban people in Cuba, Maybe they get shut out of business deals, they get isolated, they become ostracized within the community. So it's a real problem. And it really is interesting how it acts so much like the mafia. Um, and we see, that the lobby has changed a little bit. We are seeing the narrative shifting a bit. The younger Cubans, now that the older Cubans have sort of died off, the old expats from the 60s, they've died off. We're seeing these younger Cubans that are starting to say, hey, we really don't want to continue this sort of irrational relationship that we've got going on. This doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. And so you're starting to see some voices shifting, very similar to actually what we're seeing with a lot of Jewish Americans in regards to the US policy with Israel, the Israeli Palestinian conflict. We're seeing some of that rumbling shift. Now, the majority are still very much no, we're pro Israel, we're anti Palestine, we're going to do whatever we need to do to protect Israel. We still see the majority in that way. And a lot of that is because AIPAC has been very powerful at buying off a lot of politicians. But we're seeing that sort of shift in a bit of the narrative. And one thing that I think we can learn, those who are really wanting to open up relations with Cuba, those who really want to see a better, the Cuban Americans who would like to see better relationships with Cuba, would like to see this irrational policy lifted. The thing to learn would be what has gone on inside of that Jewish American sort of community. And that is AIPAC has been extremely powerful for a really, really long time. But growing in power has been J Street. And J Street, in fact, has now, I believe, bought off more of our senators now they only spend money on the Democrats. They don't spend any money on Republicans. Probably a mistake. I think they should start greasing the wheels of the Republicans, kind of lining their pockets a bit, because we all know in this country, money talks. But J Street has been able to really line the pockets of 23 senators sitting in office right now. And those are the same 23 that you'll notice wrote the letter saying that they condemned when the whole thing was going on with Gaza and Israel. We had 23 Democratic senators step forward and say, we want Israel to knock it off. There needs to be a more measured approach to this. And that is because those are the same senators who are getting a lot more money from J Street these days than AIPAC. And that is unfortunately in this country, because the only color this country cares about is green. The way to combat this irrational lobby and the narrative and blockade against Cuba would be for a different lobby to rise up, and that lobby to then buy off politicians and change the entire scope of how the US views Cuba. I don't know how likely that is, because the difference with this group versus AIPAC and J Street is that the Cuba lobby uses way more mafia style tactics. They're not just using money, they're using character assassination and bullying. And that is really difficult to combat inside the community. So if somebody inside the community wants to open up relations and maybe even wants to start a lobby, they're facing some serious ostracization. Am I saying that right? They'd be ostracized by their community, and that is very obviously alienating and damaging for people. So people are very, very afraid to do that. But we just really need to understand that the real culprit behind this mess in Cuba, the real culprit behind the US barricade, blockade, embargo that we've got going on with Cuba is the Cuba lobby. It's these Cuban Floridians who are the problem. They're controlling our US foreign policy in regards to Cuba and much of Latin America for that matter. And it is damaging for our nation, damaging for our foreign policy, for our national security. It's irrational. It doesn't make sense. We need to stay out of it, and we need to call it out. We need to call out these Cuban Floridians and say, we've had enough of you. You have a bad idea. You need to stop. You need to let it go. Let it go. Move on. Let the Cuban people live their lives. We need to lift the blockade. This is irrational and ridiculous. It's time to move on. But until we put more pressure on that Cuba lobby, until we actually start to call them out and point them out and understand who the real bad guy is, we're not going to be making any real change in this country. So that is what is really going on in Cuba behind our terrible our terrible policy is the Cuba lobby. All right. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate you guys being here and watching the show. If you'd like to get more of this style content, I do have some stuff I'm not able to post on places such like YouTube. You could go to other platforms such as Rockfin. You can also go to my locals community. Those links are down below. That is where I post other content that is more uncensored, if you will. Thank you guys so much for watching. And if you'd like to email me your thoughts, I always love to hear from you, Kim@KimIverson.com.